Every spring, Arthur placed fresh roses on the same park bench for someone who never came. This spring was no different from every other spring for nearly half a century. Along the worn cobblestone path circling the city's central park, tall oak trees had just begun to sprout pale green leaves, while cherry blossoms drifted softly through the breeze. People walked their dogs, pushed strollers, and murmured in conversation as if it were any other ordinary day. But in one corner of the park, there was a scene that repeated itself faithfully, as precise as the ticking of a clock. An old man with silver hair, moving slowly, carrying a bouquet of red roses in his arms. His name was Arthur, 68 years old, living alone in a cramped apartment on the north side of the city. Every spring, without fail, he appeared in the same place, on the same day, at the same hour. Rain or shine, he came. He would lay the roses on an old stone bench by the small pond in the park. Then he would sit down, silent for hours, his clouded eyes fixed on some faraway place. Today was no exception. Arthur walked slowly down the cobblestone path, a cane in his right hand and the flowers cradled in his left. His fingers trembled, not only from age but from some invisible weight he carried. He lowered himself onto the familiar stone bench. The cracks in the bench had become etched into his memory, as much a part of his ritual as the flowers themselves. He carefully set the bouquet down, arranging it as though someone would be arriving to claim it. The vivid red petals stood out against the dull gray stone, something too alive, too bright against the fading ruins of time. People passing by glanced at him, some puzzled, some shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath, "That old man does this every year. Must be stuck in the past. Always roses, but no one ever shows up." The murmurs drifted past Arthur's ears, leaving no trace. He sat still, his back slightly hunched, his bony hand resting on the cane, his eyes fixed firmly on the path that led to the park's gate, an expression both resolute and quietly waiting for something he could never name. Among the onlookers that day, one woman lingered longer than the rest. She was young, about 30, dressed simply, a beige knit cardigan, blue jeans, sneakers, a small bag slung over her shoulder. She had only meant to cut through the park on her way to work, but when she passed the bench, her eyes stopped. The sight of the frail old man, silver-haired, sitting beside a blazing bouquet of roses, slowed her steps without her realizing it. She had heard vaguely of the Rose Old Man, a nickname some neighbors had given Arthur. They said he was eccentric, even a little mad, for bringing flowers every year for someone who never appeared. But standing there, seeing it with her own eyes, she didn't see madness. She saw something strangely calm and painful. From a short distance, she watched the old man sit motionless. His face was expressionless, but his eyes told another story. They weren't empty. They carried something deep, something held tight inside, a memory binding him to this bench, holding him captive. The young woman felt a stirring of curiosity, mixed with something like compassion. How could a person devote himself to one act with such unshakable persistence, almost like obsession? Who was he waiting for? And why had they never come? On a nearby bench, two elderly women whispered, "It's the day again, the day he brings the flowers, same every year." "I feel sorry for him. waiting and waiting, but no one ever comes. I heard when he was young, he courted a girl. She never showed up, and ever since then." Arthur remained silent. Perhaps his ears still caught the words, but he didn't bother to reply. He was used to it. For years, such whispers had become part of the park's background noise, like wind or falling leaves. They no longer touched him. Only the roses on the bench remained alive, as though every spring Arthur tore away a fragment of his heart's last strength and left it blooming there in red. The young woman studied him more closely. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his skin grayish, his lips pressed tight. Yet in his eyes she saw one truth. They were not the eyes of a man who had forgotten, but someone who still remembered. That memory was both faith and wound, so long sustained until it had become part of his very being. She shivered. For an instant, the old man didn't feel like a stranger at all. His face, his gaze, something about them stirred familiarity in her, though she couldn't name it. She thought of moving on. Work awaited, life pressed forward. But her feet refused. Instead, she chose a bench a few meters away and sat down. From there, she could observe him without being noticed. And so, while others drifted away, leaving only the old man and the roses, her gaze remained, patient and steady. She wondered, tomorrow would he return? And the next day? And if she came back too, could she find an answer to this quiet mystery? As evening came, Arthur finally rose. He bent to straighten the flowers one last time, as though afraid they might shift out of place. Then he turned, leaning on his cane, and slowly left the park. The young woman stayed seated, her eyes following him until he disappeared beyond the trees. Only then did she draw a deep breath. Inside her, a clear decision formed. Tomorrow, she would come back. She wanted to know. She wanted to understand how a man could wait for so many years. That was the beginning, the moment she ceased being just a passerby and became the witness to a story about to unfold.
Arthur's hands trembled, not from age, but from remembering. Arthur's thin hands quivered as he placed the bouquet of roses on the familiar stone bench. The trembling was not merely the weakness of a body that had lived 68 years, but the echo of memories creeping back in. Each crimson petal before him was like a doorway into the past, leading him back to days long gone, days filled with light and hope. The young woman was there again. She sat at a measured distance, pretending to read a book, though her eyes often strayed toward him. In her lap was a small, pale blue notebook. Every time Arthur made a movement, laying down the flowers, straightening a stem, lowering himself onto the bench, resting his hand on the cane, she recorded it carefully. Line by line, her notes filled the page. 11:15, he arrives at the park. 11:17, places flowers. 11:20, sits down, silent. 11:35, eyes fixed at the gate. She began to notice the smallest details, how he always carried the flowers in his left hand while his right gripped the cane, how he adjusted the bouquet with precise care as if expecting someone to come and claim it, how he leaned forward slightly when sitting, his gaze never lingering on passers-by, but always fixed on the long path leading to the old train station beyond the park. The image repeated itself unchanged, day after day. The more she wrote, the thicker the mystery seemed to wrap around him. On the bench nearby, the old ladies of the park began their familiar conversation. One woman, silver-haired, fingering her rosary, shook her head. "He's been doing this for decades, since I was young." Another added, "I asked him once.
He only smiled, said nothing. Every spring, same day, he brings the flowers. I heard he once loved a girl. She never came to meet him. Since then, he's just been waiting, waiting. Their voices fell like they were retelling some sad half-legend. The young woman listened, her heartbeat quickening. She didn't know how much of it was true, but one thing was clear. This man was not ordinary. Not in the sense of madness, but in the sense that he lived to the rhythm of another world, the rhythm of memory. By late afternoon, Arthur rose again. He leaned on his cane and walked slowly toward the park gate, his small frame swallowed by the rush of strangers. The young woman hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. She followed him. Arthur lived in an old apartment block on the city's north side. The wooden stairwell creaked, the walls were peeling. His flat was on the 3rd floor, its door painted green, now faded and chipped. He unlocked it and stepped inside, unaware of the pair of eyes watching from the shadows below. Inside, the apartment was sparse: a narrow iron bed, a wooden table, a few dusty shelves, a battered teapot. On the table sat a dark wooden box, its edges worn with time. Arthur sat down beside it and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were letters, yellowed with age. The paper was so fragile it might tear at a touch. He held them with both hands as though cradling something sacred. On the envelopes were delicate strokes of feminine handwriting, ink blurred by decades. Arthur opened one letter. The faded words surfaced under the dim glow of the lamp. "My dearest Arthur, tomorrow I will come to the park. There are so many things I want to tell you." The ink dissolved into faint smudges, almost vanished, but Arthur knew the words by heart. He closed his eyes and recited them silently from memory. And the memories rushed in like waves. He saw himself in 1970, a young man of 20, standing before a mirror, adjusting his tie, heart racing. He saw the brightness of his own eyes back then, the nervous hands clutching his very first bouquet. He saw the park, the stone bench, the spring sunlight, and the bird song, and the empty place where someone should have been. Arthur set the letter down and sighed. He sat by the window staring out at the night sky, fractured with streetlight glow. His reflection in the glass looked old, worn, and tired. From his dry lips escaped a single whisper. Margaret. That name had lived inside him for decades, never fading, never leaving. Down the narrow street, the young woman still stood in the shadows, gazing up at the lit window. She heard nothing, only saw the silhouette of an old man alone in a pool of yellow light. But in that moment, she understood that this story reached far deeper than any rumor, and she decided she would return. She had to uncover the truth.
The smell of old ink dragged him back to the spring of 1970. The faint odor of aged ink rising from the yellowed letter made Arthur reel. That dry, musty scent was like a secret door creaking open, carrying him back to a distant life when his 20s brimmed with youth and his heart still raced with love. That year, 1970. Arthur was 20, with thick brown hair and bright eyes, filled with both fervor and the innocence of youth. The world then felt vast, promising, full of horizons yet to be touched. At university, he stood out not for his looks, but for his gentle manner, sometimes awkward, always sincere. And then he met Margaret. Margaret entered Arthur's life like a shard of radiant light. Her golden hair shimmered, her blue eyes as clear as a spring lake, her smile carrying a quiet comfort. They first met at a student performance. Arthur, usually a quiet young man, found himself drawn to her laughter,
to the way her voice lingered as she sang a love song on stage. After that, their paths crossed often, studying together in the library, walking through the old park, sipping coffee in a little corner cafe. The cafe was nothing fancy, a few dark wooden tables, the sharp aroma of roasted beans filling the air. But for them, it was paradise. There, Arthur would speak with passion about his dream of becoming a writer, while Margaret shared her yearning to travel the world, capturing life's stories in images. The more time he spent with her, the clearer it became Margaret wasn't just a girl he cared for, she was everything. He loved the way she tilted her head to listen intently, loved the way she giggled when he stumbled over words. Arthur's shy heart had grown braver than ever before. May 1970. The park overflowed with roses in bloom. Crimson and blush petals burst open along the stone paths. Arthur chose that moment to confess his feelings. He asked Margaret, "Saturday afternoon, meet me at the bench under the oak tree. I have something to tell you." Margaret smiled, a bright smile, though for an instant her eyes seemed distant. Still, she nodded. "All right. Saturday afternoon." That day, Arthur arrived early. He wore a neatly pressed white shirt, a bouquet of red roses trembling in his hands. His heart pounded, nervous, hopeful, afraid. The oak bench had been their place, where they had shared small stories, laughter, dreams. Today, it would witness his confession. He sat there waiting. Birdsong rustled above, wind whispered through leaves, the distant laughter of children echoed across the park. Time stretched painfully thin. Arthur checked his watch. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Margaret never came. Still he waited, eyes fixed on the small path that led to the bench. Every passing figure stabbed his heart with sudden hope, only to snuff it out again. The sun sank, spilling golden light across the park. Arthur didn't leave. He was certain she was only late, certain she would appear with her smile as always. But she didn't. Night fell. The park lamps flickered on. The air grew cold. Arthur clutched the roses, rose to his feet, and walked away, hollow with disappointment. That night he laid the bouquet on his desk, listening for a knock at the door. But the only sound in the little room was the indifferent ticking of the clock. The next day and the next, Arthur returned to the bench, waiting. But Margaret vanished, as though she had never existed. No explanation, no letter, no trace. Arthur staggered, lost. From then his life bent in another direction. He spoke less, withdrew into himself. The dream of becoming a writer withered away, replaced by long, quiet days. He lived, he worked, but his heart had been abandoned in that park. Now, 50 years later, in 2020, Arthur sat in his small apartment, his hands trembling as he held a faded letter, the single letter he had ever found from Margaret, buried in the old wooden box, written hastily, the slanted script still hers. "Arthur, if one day I cannot come, please don't be angry. I hope you'll be happy with someone else, somewhere else. Margaret." Arthur read it again and again, every word slicing deeper. He never knew why Margaret hadn't come. All he had was this brief note, no explanation, no second chance. He set the letter down, staring blankly out the window. The city had changed beyond recognition, But the old park still stood, the stone bench still stood, and for decades he had still left roses there, as though in a sacred ritual. Arthur whispered, his voice breaking into the night air. "Why didn't you come, Margaret?" It was the same question he had carried in his heart for over half a century, still waiting for an answer that never came.
The bench creaked as someone else sat down beside him. The stone bench gave a faint creak, just enough to startle Arthur. He had grown used to the silence around him, the whisper of wind through the leaves, the chirping of small birds in the morning, and the distant footsteps of passers-by who rarely paid him any mind. But today was different. Someone had chosen to sit right beside him in the very spot where the scent of roses still lingered in the air. Arthur turned his head, his clouded eyes betraying a hint of caution. He saw a young woman, a vaguely familiar face, her bright eyes steady yet touched with hesitation. She was the same woman he had noticed from time to time lately, standing at a distance, watching quietly, like a shadow that followed without a word. Arthur gave a slight nod, intending to turn back as though nothing had happened, but his silence itself seemed to press the young woman into speaking first. "Excuse me, am I disturbing you?" Her voice was gentle, tinged with nervousness. Arthur didn't answer right away. His thin, trembling hand rested on the bouquet of red roses he had just laid down. At last, he spoke in a low, rough voice. "No, but it's rare for anyone to choose this seat." She gave a faint smile, sadder than joyful. "The flowers are for someone who was late to a meeting." The vague reply explained nothing, yet concealed nothing either. It made her heart stir. After weeks of silent watching, this was the first time he had spoken about the flowers. The young woman's name was Elena. She was 30 years old, a freelance journalist for a local paper. From the very first day she had seen Arthur place roses on the bench, she had been drawn to the strange ritual, to the mix of resolve and sorrow etched on his face. At first, she had intended only to observe and take notes. Perhaps his story could become a human interest piece. But the more she watched, the more she found herself swept into an inexplicable current of feeling. Arthur's patience, his quiet endurance, and that solitary, aging figure stirred something within her that she could not name. Today, she had decided to take a step further, not just to watch from afar, but to sit down beside him. They sat in silence for a long while. The wind rustled through the branches, shaking down a few early autumn leaves. Arthur stared straight ahead, as though following an invisible figure. Elena stole glances at him now and then, waiting for some sign that she might continue the conversation. In the end, it was Arthur who broke the silence. "You're here often, aren't you?" Elena startled. You noticed?" Arthur nodded slightly. "The old may not be quick anymore, but we still have eyes to see who passes by again and again." She flushed, smiling awkwardly. "I'm sorry, I was just curious about your flowers." Arthur pressed his lips together, his gaze turning distant. "People are often curious about what looks unusual, but to me, it's ordinary. It's a duty." "Duty?" Elena tilted her head. Arthur said no more. His eyes remained fixed on the roses, on the bench that had endured countless seasons of rain and sun. In the days that followed, Elena continued to come to the park. At first, Arthur kept his distance,
offering no more than a nod of greeting, but gradually her quiet presence seemed less an intrusion. Sometimes he even greeted her first. They began exchanging small remarks about the weather, the sparrows in the park, or the sound of a boy practicing guitar on the nearby lawn. Trivial matters, but a new rhythm in a life once filled only with silence. Elena found that Arthur was not a man of many words, yet whenever he spoke, his slow, husky voice carried a peculiar weight, as though each word had been filtered through thick layers of time, steeped in memory. One day, Elena asked, "Do you live nearby?" Arthur answered, "Yes, just a small apartment, no one there but me." "Do you have a family?" Arthur gave a faint, sorrowful smile, like an old scar. He didn't answer, only brushed his fingers gently over the rose petals. In that moment, Elena understood he would not easily open his heart, yet he had begun to let her step into his silent world. That evening, as Elena rose to leave, Arthur said unexpectedly, "Young lady, thank you for sitting with me." The simple words made Elena's eyes sting. Arthur had realized that her presence had made his solitude just a little less heavy. Her hand shook as she unfolded the letter. Her tan trembled as she unfolded the yellowed paper, the brittle creases suggesting it had lain hidden in darkness for decades. The musty scent of aged paper drifted up, mingling with the smell of rotting wood from the old family cabinet. The young woman sat down on the floor, heart pounding, her eyes fixed on the faded words before her. The room had always been nothing more than a storage place for meaningless keepsakes to most of the family. A dark wooden cabinet, a few scattered boxes, some old photographs of faces no one remembered. But today, the room seemed to transform into a doorway, opening onto a secret long buried, one no one in the family had ever spoken of. She hadn't expected to find anything remarkable, only opened the long-forgotten cabinet out of curiosity. Yet when she lifted the dusty cloth and uncovered that envelope, her heart was pulled backward into a past she had never lived. On the envelope, in slanted, delicate handwriting, were the words, "To Arthur." The name made her freeze. Arthur, the man she had been observing for months in the park, the quiet old man who laid flowers each day upon the weathered bench. Her hand shook so badly she nearly tore the paper as she unfolded the envelope. The desk lamp's light fell across the handwritten lines. "Arthur, if you are reading this letter, it means I did not have the courage to give it to you myself. But I want you to know, tomorrow afternoon I will be at the park, at our familiar bench. I want to tell you that I choose you and no one else. Margaret." The final line caught in her throat. Margaret, her grandmother. The letter slipped from her hand as tears welled up, blurring the already faded ink. Shards of half-remembered family tales rushed back, fragments of her grandmother's youth, photographs of her smiling gently, her eyes dark and deep. But never, in all those stories, had anyone spoken of a man named Arthur. Suddenly, everything was clear. Arthur, the man she had thought so strange, so silent, so alone, was not a stranger at all. He was her grandmother's lost love. And he had waited for 50 years. She sat motionless for hours, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. In the silence of the room, the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock. Outside, dusk settled, pale light seeping through the dusty window. "Grandmother," she whispered, her voice breaking. Now she understood. Every flower Arthur had placed, every glance he cast toward the empty bench, every sigh had all been for her. And her grandmother, in her youth,
had chosen him too. Fate alone had stolen their last chance. She pressed the letter to her chest and wept. The grief was no longer just Arthur's nor her grandmother's. It had become her own, as though the past refused to sleep. That night she could not close her eyes. The house was silent, the family asleep, but she sat by the window, staring into the darkness, heart heavy. She thought of Arthur, sitting alone on that park bench, his frail hand resting on the bouquet. He would never know. He would never know that Margaret had been on her way to him, that she had chosen him, and that cruel fate had intervened. Should she tell him? Would he even survive the truth after half a century of waiting in fragile hope? But if she stayed silent, he would go on believing Margaret had forgotten, that she had broken her promise. Her heart tore between fear and duty. The next morning, with birdsong rising outside the window, she returned to the memory room. She needed proof. She needed to be certain. In a wooden box beside the letter, she found old photographs. Margaret, in her youth, seated at a wooden table, hair loose, eyes radiant. Beside her, a young man, his face heartbreakingly familiar. Arthur. She nearly dropped the photograph. It was him. There could be no mistake. The same eyes, though now lined with age. The same figure, though now frail. In the photograph they were smiling, a smile full of hope, the light of youth. She clutched the photo and the letter to her chest as tears spilled once more. No doubt remained that her grandmother Margaret was the very woman Arthur had waited for all these years. That afternoon she returned to the park. Arthur was there, as always, seated silently at the bench, a fresh bouquet before him. His eyes gazed into the distance, blind to the crowds passing by. She stood at a distance, her heart racing. In her bag lay Margaret's letter and the photograph. She wanted to pull them out, to hand them to him right then, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. One word, one piece of paper could change everything. It could bring Arthur peace, or it could shatter him. Because sometimes the truth is crueler than lies. She turned away, walking quickly out of the park, tears streaming down her face, but inside her decision was made. She would not let him live in the shadow of a misunderstanding. He deserved to know. That night she sat at her desk, Margaret's letter spread before her. She read it again, this time without trembling, but with resolve. Pen in her hand, she began to write another letter, one for Arthur. In it, she told him everything, that Margaret had loved him, had chosen him, had gone to the park that day, but a tragic accident had taken her before she could reach him. And she, Margaret's grandmother, had stumbled upon the unsent letter. When she folded her own letter, her fingers brushed across Margaret's final words. I choose you. A small line, yet enough to change the course of an entire life.
The newspaper clipping was yellow, but the pain was fresh. The old newspaper lay hidden among stacks of faded documents, its rough edges looking as though the slightest touch might tear it. The young woman's hands trembled as she turned the page. The afternoon light in the library cast a dull yellow hue across her face, the same shade as the forgotten memories preserved here. She had been watching Arthur for weeks, from the roses placed on the stone bench to his silent, unsmiling demeanor, to the faraway gaze fixed on nothingness. Everything about him urged her to search for answers. Who was he waiting for, and why had he been so patient for so many decades? The town library was a place few visited anymore. The young relied on their phones. The old carried their memories in their heads, with no need to read them again. But she believed Arthur's past had to be recorded somewhere. Fragments of print, words that seemed lifeless,
might in fact be the key to unlocking his mystery. She sat before the microfilm screen, carefully scrolling through year after year, month after month. Old reports flickered like echoes from a distant world. Wars, natural disasters, murders blurred by time. And then she stopped when she reached the year 1970. A small headline, easy to overlook. Tragic accident near train station. Young woman killed on her way to an appointment. Her heart clenched. Her eyes raced across the faded lines. That May afternoon, a freight train derailed near the suburban station. The crowd panicked, pushing and shoving. In the chaos, a young woman in her 20s was pulled under and never stood again. The girl's name, Margaret Lane. The young woman let the clipping fall from her fingers. The fragments in her mind suddenly aligned into a sharp, clear picture. Margaret, the one Arthur had spoken of. She had been on her way to the park, to the bench where he waited, but fate had stopped her at the station. Arthur had waited, not knowing, believing she had chosen not to come, and from that day forward he lived his entire life in hopeless anticipation. Her throat tightened. She imagined that long-ago afternoon, a young man of 20 holding a bouquet, eyes scanning every passerby at the stone bench, a young woman in a white dress hurrying down the station steps, heart pounding at the thought of being late, a screech of metal, a train lurching off its tracks, and in just seconds, a permanent chasm opened between them. Her hand flew to her mouth. All these years, Arthur had likely never known the truth. He had lived with doubt, blame, and finally obsession. To others he was a figure of pity or even ridicule, but no one knew that behind it all was nothing more than a tragedy of love. The library was silent. Only the ceiling fan hummed overhead. The young woman carefully copied down the clipping and folded it into her notebook. Rising to her feet, she walked past the dusty shelves. Outside the window, the afternoon sun was fading, but inside her chest, another light had just been kindled, the light of truth. On her way home, she passed by the old train station. It was nearly deserted now, with only a few trains stopping each day. Yet when she looked at the steps, she almost saw the figure of a young woman falling and heard the faint echo of a desperate cry. The peaceful scene of the present suddenly felt heavy, burdened with the trace of a past that had never been set free. She lingered for a long while. In her mind, a question echoed. If Arthur knew the truth, what would become of him? Would he feel peace at last, or collapse under the weight of unbearable sorrow? A part of her wanted to keep silent, to let him go on living with his belief, but another part urged her to return the truth to him, however belated. That night, in her small room, she spread her notes across the desk. Arthur's name, the roses, the stone bench, and now the name Margaret, all forming a picture she could no longer turn away from. Through the window, she saw the yellow glow from the apartment across the street. Arthur sat at his table, his back hunched, hands trembling as he held a worn piece of paper. She knew it was the love letter he always kept in the wooden box. His face was lost in shadow, only his lips moving faintly. She couldn't hear, but she could guess. He was softly calling a name. Margaret. The young woman froze. The clipping in the library, the whispered name across the window, together told her that Arthur had lived his whole life with a question that was never answered. And now, she was the one who held the answer. She clutched her notebook tightly, her gaze fixed on Arthur with a feeling entirely new, no longer curiosity or suspicion, but a blend of pity and resolve.
In the days to come, she knew she could no longer stand aside as a mere observer.
The truth sat heavy on her tongue. The words echoed in the young woman's mind as she sat down on the familiar stone bench in the old park. The afternoon light was fading. The last rays stretched thin like golden silk, draping over the rows of trees and casting broken shadows on the ground. Arthur was there, as always, frail and thin, his shoulders trembling with the weary rhythm of age. He still wore his faded fedora, one hand trembling as it leaned against the worn wooden cane. For days now she had come to sit with him, sharing fragments of trivial stories. Slowly, Arthur had accepted her presence, though his eyes often remained distant, lost in memories of half a century ago. But today was different. Today she carried a secret too heavy to keep, a truth that could change everything. Her throat tightened. Her heart pounded as though it might burst from her chest. Arthur tilted his head slightly, his gaze kind yet sorrowful. He could see her hesitation.
"You have something to tell me, don't you?"
His voice was raspy, slow. The young woman bit her lip, clutching the hem of her coat. The truth weighed on her tongue like a stone, impossible to swallow, impossible to keep locked inside. At last, she drew a deep breath and let the words fall out. "Mr. Arthur, I'm Margaret's grandmother." The words shattered the quiet of the park like a bell breaking. Arthur froze, his gaze stiffening before trembling as though a cold wind had pierced his heart. What did you say?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The young woman nodded, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. "My grandmother was Margaret, the woman you've been waiting for all these 50 years. Arthur covered his mouth, his whole body trembling. His eyes filled with tears, as though a door to memory had burst open and a flood of the past had swept through. He murmured, voice broken, "Dear God, Margaret, so she never forgot me." The young woman hurried to explain. Piece by piece, she told him what she had discovered in recent days. The old newspaper clipping in the library, the 1970 train accident, the letter never sent, hidden away in the wooden cabinet of her grandmother's house. "She wrote to you. She said she would come, that she would meet you here in the park. But on the way, the accident happened. She never made it. The letter was still there, never delivered." Arthur sat in stunned silence, his head bowed, his frail hands shook as though drained of all strength. Tears slipped down his wrinkled face, seeping into the lines carved by time. "So all these years, I blamed her wrongly. I thought she didn't come because she'd forgotten me. I've lived in that bitterness my whole life." The young woman sobbed as well. She grasped his trembling hand. "No, Mr. Arthur, she never forgot you. She simply never had the chance to see you again." Arthur lifted his gaze, peering into her eyes, and in them he saw a fragment of Margaret, the same tender warmth, familiar yet achingly painful. You are really her granddaughter?" he asked again, as if this wasn't a dream. "Yes, she often told my mother stories, but always in fragments, in hints. I never imagined the man she spoke of was you, not until I found the letter." The evening wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of leaves. The park grew strangely still. In that silence, Arthur felt his whole life circle back to the spring of 1970, to the place where a love was left unfinished in tears. He squeezed the girl's hand more tightly, his voice trembling but full of emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for bringing me this truth." The young woman broke into sobs. She had never imagined that one sentence could bring such release. In that moment, she felt the invisible thread linking 2 generations, the young man of 20 once waiting on this very bench, and herself, the granddaughter of the woman he had loved all his life. Arthur whispered, his eyes still wet, but brighter than they had ever been. "So, she never left me." The girl nodded, choking back tears. "And now, you don't have to wait alone anymore." Arthur smiled, a trembling, fragile smile, yet warm, as though a burden of half a century had finally lifted. He placed his dry, frail hand over hers, closed his eyes, and whispered into the evening air, "Thank you for bringing Margaret back to me." And in that moment, the old and the young, 2 generations bound by love and grief, sat in silence, their hearts beating in unison. A love once unfinished had at last returned to the light, belated yet still whole. Arthur held her hand, grateful for the truth she had given him. Spring came again, but this time the bench was not empty. Spring returned. The gentle breeze brushed against the tender green leaves. Flower buds stretched from the earth, as if urging each other to step out of their long sleep. The old park, which for so many years had witnessed the endless waiting of an old man, suddenly felt different today. That familiar stone bench, where people had grown used to seeing a lonely figure with a bouquet of red roses, was no longer empty. Arthur sat down, his trembling hands holding the bouquet as always. But this time, beside him was a young, gentle face, eyes filled with compassion and understanding. The young woman sitting next to him turned slightly, offering a quiet smile. He placed the flowers down on the bench where time had left its deep marks. "For her and for you." His voice was hoarse, yet warm, as though both entrusting and passing something on. The woman stayed silent. Tears slid down her cheeks, yet her smile remained. Because now she understood. Love never disappears. It only transforms, flowing through generations until one day it is continued. In the days after the late confession, there was no distance between her and Arthur. They met often, not only in the park, but at a small cafe near the square, a place he had rarely visited before. He was old, his health no longer as it once was, but since the truth had been revealed, a new vitality seemed to live within him. Arthur began to tell stories of the past he had never shared before. He spoke of Margaret not as a distant shadow, but as a companion, a part of his very being that had never left. The young woman listened, memorizing every word. Each time Arthur mentioned her name, his eyes lit up, filled with both joy and sorrow. "You know," Arthur said once, "every time I placed a rose on this bench, I believed that somewhere she could see it, that she might smile, that she might hear my words. And now, with you sitting here, I know for certain she never truly disappeared." The woman nodded. In her heart, his words etched themselves like a vow. That spring day, Arthur and she sat together on the bench. The red roses lay there, brilliant against the stirring spring breeze. The park wasn't crowded, just a few children running about, a few couples strolling hand in hand. No one paid much attention to the two figures sitting side by side, one old, one young, but between them ran an invisible current, love, loss, and continuity. Arthur gazed into the distance, as if looking through the trees, through the sky itself, searching for a familiar figure. He smiled faintly. "Margaret, today I am no longer alone." She heard, but did not interrupt. That was a conversation between him and memory, between him and the love he had lost. Suddenly he turned toward her. "When I'm gone, will you promise to keep bringing the flowers?" She silently nodded. "I promise, not just for her, but for you." Arthur clasped her hand, his thin, trembling fingers held firmly. Tears threatened, but he did not cry. He smiled, the smile of a man who had waited a lifetime and at last found peace. In the weeks that followed, Arthur weakened quickly. The young woman still visited, sometimes bringing flowers from her own garden. Each time she found him by the window, eyes gazing far away, as though still looking toward the park. One afternoon, Arthur called her over and handed him an old wooden box. Inside are some photographs, some keepsakes of me and Margaret. I want you to keep them. Don't let them fade away like an old newspaper clipping. She opened it and found faded black and white photos, a few pressed flowers, and a handkerchief embroidered with the letter M. Tears fell, soaking the fabric. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'll keep them all, and I'll carry it on." Arthur nodded. He closed his eyes, the smile still on his lips. The next spring, the park bench still stood. The bouquet of red roses appeared again, but this time it was not Arthur who placed it there. The young woman sat on the bench, cradling the flowers in her arms, her eyes gazing into the distance where he once looked. The spring breeze stirred, carrying the scent of roses like a whisper from the past. She set the flowers down on the bench and smiled gently. "For her, and for you." Her heart ached, yet was filled with peace, because she knew that love does not die. It is passed from one to another, from one generation to the next. The park bench, which had borne witness to Arthur's endless waiting, had now become the guardian of an undying love. People still saw roses appear there each spring, and slowly the story was whispered throughout the town like a legend. Arthur was gone, but he was no longer lonely. Margaret had passed, but her love had not vanished, and the young woman, Margaret's granddaughter, had become the bridge that ensured their love lived on, untouched by time. The old bench beneath the spring breeze was no longer just a bench. It had become a symbol of love that never dies. The bench in the old park still stood, silent witness to time. It had seen Arthur's endless years of waiting, had heard his whispered hopes, and kept quiet through his tears. But it also became the place where past and present met, where love found its way back. The love of Margaret and Arthur, though unfinished, had never been lost. It was preserved in an old letter, in an unquenched longing. The young woman, Margaret's granddaughter, had uncovered the truth and given it to Arthur, a belated but precious gift. His waiting was no longer in vain. It became proof of an eternal love. And so spring came again. The roses placed on the bench were not only for Margaret, but for everyone who believes that love, even when late, can heal. Arthur was no longer alone, for now beside him was a young soul, a thread binding love across generations. And the bench was no longer a place of silent waiting. It had become a symbol of love that never dies. If you too believe that true love can endure beyond time, leave a small trace, a follow, a share, so that this story may touch more hearts. Perhaps, somewhere out there, someone is also sitting on a bench, waiting for something beautiful of their own.